Ken Hill Coaching, and we're back with our video series on comparing data with different types of riders. So we've looked at the data between kind of a pro racer and a new rider, and a pro racer and an amateur racer. And now we'll kind of get into the nitty-gritty, which is comparing two pro racers, and both with a little bit of an interesting circumstance. And so in this case, we have two riders with a fairly similar lap time, and we have a rider with a little bit slower lap time is starting to question the bike's setup. So issues where the bike's not finishing a corner, and some grip issues. So when we compare something like this, we want to make sure again that our point of reference lap is solid, and we know that the rider with the quicker lap time, we know not just because his lap time's quicker, but because we have validated that his direction's okay via video and also spotting. So we know that the lap itself is a solid lap. So let's first dive into what that looks like. So let me bring this up. And we'll start off with the speed graph, because when we look, the speed graph again still tells us quite a bit of what's going on. And so just by looking at the speed graph here, let me bring up some stuff here to write on for everybody. Whoops, let me clear that off. So when we bring this up, we automatically, again, we start off with slowest points of the corners, right? We want to make sure our slow points are where they need to be. And so the faster riders in blue, the slower riders in red. And it becomes clear that the rider with the better lap time basically has a more deliberate and concise slow point of the corner. And not only that, it's faster as well. And this is something that I've said, that when you get your slow point of the corner correctly, so when you get it correct and you can bring the proper entry and the proper exit for it, your corner speed will take care of itself. And I'm not saying that's something we don't have to work on, but I'm just saying that you'll get a big chunk of it by just having the correct entry and having the correct exit. And that's why we focus so heavily on that. So in this case, pretty interesting. This is about a 1.5 seconds difference. So quite a lot of difference. And even if we were to break this down where it was just a few tenths, we'd still see these things. So the rider with the faster lap, you can see into turn one, he goes to the brakes or starts his deceleration later. And then you can see that it's much more concise of a slow point. So, right, he gets to it and gets from it. Where the rider with the slower lap time comes in, and then basically you can see that it changes, and the speed, even though he's still slowing down, the rate of deceleration changes, and then his slow point is late, which just kills his exit. Same thing here, is he slows down, his rate of acceleration is different, and the slow point is slower and doesn't quite accelerate. Here's interesting, where he actually decelerates later, but then is rushed at the slow point. And look at the difference it makes on acceleration. At that level, I mean, that's huge. So you can complain about the rear tire, you can complain about the shock, or you can complain about the geometry when it's a bike placement issue. And we'll show you how we prove that here in a little bit. The slower rider gets in to this section quite a bit quicker. And then actually they have literally the opposite graphs. And at this point, because he got in so fast, it was harder to control where the bike was going to be slowed. And then he paid for it down this entire straightaway, just paid for it. Ended up getting back to about the same speed, but that is a pretty massive amount of time lost right there. We could do the math on it, but my guess is that's a 3 or 4 tenths difference in just not having the bike in the right place. It's not, right? It's not a gearing issue. It's not a mapping issue. It's a bike placement issue. And then you can see how they again start to trade places here, trade places here, and then even this slow point is a little bit late. So fundamentally, we have a bike placement issue. That's where it starts with. And then we can say, okay, great. Well, then how do we either prove this, or how do we dive into this a little bit further? And so the way that we're going to do that is I want to look at then another graph, which is, let's see if we can get this one brought up. The next graph that I want to look at is the throttle graph. And you can see that you'll see how difficult it is for the rider that's a little bit slower lap time to get off the corner. And we know the bike's not pointed because we're going to prove it here in just a second. So you can see, and this is the subtleness of our sport and why understanding where direction is and motor controls and eyes and reference points, why these fundamentals make such a big difference. So here, again, we go into coming out of turn 1. You can see the rider with the slower lap time tries to go back to the throttle, but can't because the bike's not pointed. So he actually has to give up the throttle and then finally gets to it, but really quite never gets the full throttle. The other rider gets the full throttle earlier because the bike is pointed better. And you can see where the difference that makes in the throttle graph. So here in this sort of turn 2 area, the rider with the slower lap time goes to throttle, but because again, has more lean angle, never quite gets to full throttle. Not a big time difference there, but there's still a time difference here. Same thing here, the bike's not pointed correctly. Rider has to give it up. Look how they're fighting direction right here, right? Go to the throttle, back off, go to throttle, back off. And then, yeah, they do get to wide open. They do get to wide open throttle, but the other rider at this point has crushed them on acceleration. So yeah, pretty big deal there. And then we even see a little bit of that here in this other section is here, they're trying to go to too much throttle, have to back off. The faster rider gets to wide open throttle sooner, longer, right? It has wide open throttle longer than the other rider. And then here as well, where trying to pick up the throttle without direction. And it's a great example here. Goes to it, backs off, goes to it, backs off, and then finally gets the wide open throttle. And again, we see that trend right here. And then we see a little bit of that trend right in here if we blew that up. If anything, I would say that the blue rider probably had an issue right there as well, where maybe the rider in red, so the little bit of slow rider might have actually had a little bit of a better exit right there. But look at the speed graph, it's pretty split right there. So we would talk to this rider and say, we don't need to change your bike. We need you to change where you're at on the track. And until we see consistent throttle pickups. When I say consistent throttle pickups, actually, let's talk about that a little bit. What I mean by that is, and there's some very good examples of that in here. What I mean by that is, even though depending on the speed, here's a case where the rider in blue, once they went to the throttle, they never gave the throttle up to wide open throttle. And another case here where, even though it was, I know this corner and I can understand the dynamics of the exit, even in this case, he kept the throttle moving to wide open throttle, where the rider in red had to give it up. Even right here, the rider in blue, even though he had to pause a little bit right there, he didn't give it up all the way and still built really good acceleration. And you can see, as soon as you give up that little throttle that we saw here, that's what really equals that speed difference right there. So some really good graphs for people to see that these things are answerable and how we look at data. And until we get some of these things fixed, we really wouldn't be addressing issues on the bike unless the data said to us that the bike was out of parameters. And we've got, when we look at our suspension data, which would be another set of videos, that when we look at our suspension data, it'll tell us where the suspension should be at certain places on the track. But this starts the conversation. And again, we can make massive gains by not touching the bike, by just working on the rider. So, all right, there you go. There's pro rider versus pro rider. And these are the same things that we can do for you by looking at your video analysis as well. So that's something that you can send in. You can get a hold of me at my email, or you can go to Racers 360 and send your data into there, and we can certainly check it out. So, all right. Thanks, everyone.